Boyd Larkin drew the report from the drawer, same as most nights, and did not open it. He never opened it. 8 years, and he still knew every line by heart, where the pen had faltered, where the truth got traded for a cleaner word, and where his own name sat quiet at the bottom, having done nothing to stop it. He had thought, more than once, about burning it. The stove sat 4 feet from the desk, banked low for evening, and 4 feet was nothing. But burning it wouldn't unmake what was written, would only mean he'd destroyed the truth twice instead of once. So it stayed where it was, filed nowhere, read by no one but him, and only in the dark, and only when the guilt got loud enough to insist on it. Outside, lightning walked the ridge of the Franklin Mountains without a sound. No rain behind it yet, just heat breaking on itself again and again, the sky rehearsing a storm it hadn't decided to keep. He put the paper back in the drawer, locked what didn't need locking, old habit, the same one that had kept 8 years shut instead of read aloud. If the truth cost you everything you'd spent a lifetime building, would you still speak it? Keep that question close. Before this night is finished, a river is going to ask a man that exact thing, and he has spent 8 years pretending he already answered it. Fort Bliss settled into evening same as always. Mess fire smoke low over the adobe, a picket line of horses stamping at flies, the Rio Grande cutting a slow silver line through the flats below the rise. 2 privates argued over a saddle strap loud enough to carry clear across the yard. Ordinary sounds, ordinary water, except the patrols had doubled that month, and the horses stayed saddled longer than they used to, and nobody said the word Victorio out loud, though everyone at the fort had taken lately to sleeping with one boot on. Boyd came out onto the porch in time to see them stopped at the rail, an old woman and a boy, though the guards knew both their faces by now and stopped them anyway. The gate bell had rung for trading hour, same as every 3rd week that season, and the ritual that followed unfolded exactly as it always did, unhurried, correct, and entirely one-sided. Corporal Reyes held his hand out for the goods first, always first. "State your business," he said, though he already knew it, asked the same question the 3rd Tuesday of every month, and got the same answer, and asked it anyway, because that was the shape the fort had given him to fill. Sani answered plain and unhurried, giving him nothing to push against. 2 blankets, dried meat, a trade for flour and salt, same terms as last month and the month before that. Nobody offered them water while they waited. Nobody ever did. A young private by the stable muttered something to the man beside him, grandmother's social call again, and laughed at his own joke before anyone told him not to. Sani didn't turn her head. Whatever she'd heard across 8 years of Tuesdays had long since stopped costing her anything to ignore. Boyd crossed the yard, took the ladle from the barrel by the well, and held it out before he'd decided to. Sani looked at it a long moment before she took it, not surprised exactly, measuring, as if deciding whether the gesture was worth the trouble of trusting. The boy stood a half-step behind his grandmother, dust to his knees, a small carved gourd canteen slung at his hip on a braided cord. He did not fidget, did not glance at the rifles racked by the door. He watched the fort in silence, patient, alert, already reading it for what it might do next. Boyd found himself watching the boy instead of the trade. Something in the set of those shoulders or the gourd riding his hip caught at a place in his chest he couldn't name and didn't try to. He had never laid eyes on this child before in his life. Of that much he was certain. He was less certain why the certainty didn't help, or why his hand had gone briefly cold around the ladle handle, or why the boy's stillness felt less like a stranger's and more like an old debt come round to collect. He almost asked the boy's name, almost, and then some old instinct pulled his hand back, quiet and quick, the reflex of a man who already knows which door leads somewhere he can't afford to go. "You're new to this gate," Sani said to Reyes, not looking up from the flour sack. 3 weeks." He wasn't. She tipped her chin toward the porch. Easy, offhand, nothing in her voice to mark it as anything at all. Reyes missed it entirely. Boyd didn't. It landed somewhere behind his ribs, and he said nothing, because there was nothing yet worth saying, and because silence was the one skill he kept sharp for 8 years running. He made himself busy checking a cinch strap that didn't need checking, hands wanting something to do besides shake. The trade finished as it always did, measured, correct, and cold. Sani cinched the flour sack shut. The boy shouldered the meat without being asked, the gourd swinging once against his hip and going still. Neither thanked the fort. Neither expected thanks in return. That, too, was the arrangement worn smooth by 8 years of repetition. Longer, maybe, though Boyd had never once let himself count how much longer. They were near the gate when the first sentry shouted, "River's running color!" A private up at the crossing, pointing north with his whole arm. "Come up brown in the last quarter hour. Something's moving it." A few heads turned. Most didn't. A brown river in spring meant little more than Tuesday, and nothing in the private's voice said otherwise. Reyes went back to his ledger. The 2 soldiers by the picket line kept right on arguing about the saddle strap. But the boy turned, all the way around, gourd swinging, eyes lifted past the rail to the water beyond. He didn't stop to look startled or curious. He just turned, like the river had called his name out loud, and the fort once again hadn't troubled itself to listen. Tuko didn't stop at looking. He said 2 words, flat, meant for no one in particular and everyone at once. "Not rain." He pointed, not at the color of the water, but at what rode on it. A raft of broken cottonwood turning slow, bark still pale where it had torn only hours before, wood that hadn't traveled far, water that hadn't traveled long, somewhere upriver, in country none of them could see from this rail. The sky had already done what this one hadn't. Not yet. The air had even started to smell different, a wet mineral cold where an hour ago there'd been only dust and horse sweat. The river was running a register nobody at Fort Bliss had ever needed to learn. "What's he seeing?" Boyd asked, "that the rest of us aren't?" Sani didn't look up from the flour sack. "Ask him yourself." Corporal Reyes gave the current half a glance. "Runs brown every spring, boy." "Not like this." Tuko didn't raise his voice to make the correction. He didn't repeat it either. He turned back to the water and let the fort go on with its ledgers. The private by the stable laughed again, the one who'd made his joke about grandmothers earlier, quieter this time, mostly to keep his hands busy coiling a picket rope that didn't need coiling. Nobody told him to stop either time. Boyd caught himself watching the boy instead of the water, the same pull from the porch an hour before, sharper now, like a name almost remembered snagging on the back of his teeth. He had no place to put the feeling, so he put his attention back on the river instead. That, at least, he knew how to read. Boyd should have let it go with the rest of them. He didn't. Instead, he crossed to the rail and looked once, hard. Water moving faster than the hour warranted, carrying more of the country with it than a normal spring thaw ever did. His palm found the wood of the rail. He felt it, a faint hum that hadn't been there 10 minutes before. He was still deciding what that meant when the rider came in off the Hueco road. Dead run, hat gone, one hand fisted in the mane. Wagon stuck at the crossing. He nearly went over the horse's neck, reining up. Hollis and Dabney. Water's already to the wheel hubs and climbing. Axle's caught on something. They can't get it free. Hollis and Dabney. The same two who'd spent the whole trading hour arguing over a saddle strap. Sent out that afternoon to fetch what the relay post owed the fort. Flour, lamp oil, due back well before dark. Ordinary men. An ordinary errand. Same as a dozen times before this season, back when the river hadn't cared enough to notice them. It cared tonight. Reyes was up and shouting before the rider finished the sentence. Men to the crossing, horses saddled, rope from the stores. The whole practiced machinery of the fort clattered into motion at last, an hour too late to matter as much as it should have. Men spilled out of the barracks half-dressed, gun belts buckled over shirts still half-buttoned, hands reaching for saddles that stood right where saddles always stood. Never fast enough. Lieutenant Voss came out still buttoning his coat and took one look at the water before he'd say a word. Which men could go now? Which would wait for full dark and torches? The correct decision by every rule the Army had ever written down. And the slow one. Nobody at that rail would have called him a coward for it. Caution had never killed a man that Fort Bliss kept a record of. It just hadn't saved one yet either. Not tonight. Not in the 2 minutes since the rider had come in with his hat gone. Shouting men and shouting orders were not the same thing as men already in the water. Everyone on that porch understood as much without a word said aloud. Horses didn't take a current they couldn't read. Neither did soldiers, not the ones who'd never had to. Boyd went for his own horse, then stopped himself, a hand flat on the saddle, not mounting yet. Waiting. For what, he couldn't have said. For someone with more bars on his collar to say the word first. Old habit, dressed up tonight as good sense. Let the man above you decide, and the deciding is his to answer for, not yours. It had worked for 8 years, and it was working right now, holding him half a step short of the horse, the same half step that had held him still once before in a place he'd spent 8 years trying not to remember. Down at the crossing, the wagon's near wheel dropped another few inches into ground. The river had turned to soup. The bed had begun to list, slow and certain as a held breath finally given up. One crate already loose, turning end over end downstream before anyone thought to grab for it. Dabney's shout carried thin over the water. Not panic yet, just urgency. A man asking for rope before he needed a rope with something already lost on the other end of it. Hollis had both reins wrapped twice around his fist, the team fighting the bit, eyes showing white, front hooves finding nothing solid to stand on. Cut the traces! Dabney was already working the wet knot at his hip, fingers going clumsy in the cold. Let the team swim it. We'll lose the wagon anyway. Not yet. Hollis didn't loosen his grip. Rope's coming. It wasn't, not for a while yet, but saying so gave both men's hands something to do besides shake. Out there, in the cold and the climbing dark, busy hands were the only prayer either of them had, the only one that wasn't a wasted breath. Sani watched the fort assemble its ropes, its riders, its careful, correct procedure. She said nothing. She'd watched it build slower machines than this for smaller emergencies. She didn't expect grace from it tonight, and the not expecting cost her nothing. She'd settled that arithmetic long before Tuko was born. Tuko had already gone. He was over the rail before Reyes finished naming the men he wanted mounted, dropped the last 2 feet into the shallows without a sound to announce it, started for the crossing at a flat, unhurried run, the kind that covered ground faster than anyone standing still would have guessed. The gourd swung hard against his hip on its braided cord, catching the last gray light on wet, dark wood, the one part of him moving faster than the rest. Boyd saw it happen. For 1 full second, he did not move at all. Then he was over the rail after him, boots hitting water already colder and higher than it had any right to be, an hour past supper, running toward a current he did not yet understand, toward a boy who, for reasons Boyd could not have named, even if his own life had hung on the naming, he was no longer willing to let it take. Tuko didn't wait for him to catch up. He cut across the current at an angle, weight low, not fighting it straight on, feet finding gravel that wasn't there for anyone else. Boyd matched him stride for stride and still lost ground. The current wanted his knees. Tuko's it barely touched. Full dark had come down without either of them noticing, the fort's lanterns already small and yellow behind them. Cold water, colder wind above it. Every sound out here belonged to the river now. The rest of Fort Bliss might as well have been a different country. The team horses screamed before Boyd even saw them. 4 animals, half submerged in their traces, eyes rolled white. The near leader was already down on its front knees, fighting the current to rise. Hollis had lost the reins somewhere behind him. Nobody was holding anything anymore. Tuko went for the leader first, not the nearest horse, but the one holding the others down. "Cut here!" He found the trace strap by feel, not sight, knife already moving, one horse loose, then the next. He worked backward through the team in an order that made no sense to Boyd, until the 3rd strap gave. The tangle didn't collapse sideways into the current. It simply eased, like a knot finding the one thread that mattered. Boyd reached the 4th horse and cut. Wrong! Too close, too fast. The animal reared half out of the water. Tuko's hand came down flat on its nose before it could bolt. One motion, no wasted force. The horse went quiet in 3 seconds. He didn't look at Boyd to make the correction. He didn't need to. 4 horses freed, not one word spent doing it. Tuko pointed the lead horse toward the rise before anyone told him where the rise was. The animal went. The others followed. Scared horses follow one calm one every time, and by the time help arrived, the worst of that particular problem had already solved itself. Reyes reached the bank behind them with rope and 6 men, torches throwing wet orange light across water, gone the color of a bruise. Voss shouted orders that landed a beat behind whatever had already happened. Orders always did, once the river decided the pace. Someone led the loose horses toward higher ground, slipping, cursing, holding on. The wagon hadn't moved. The near wheel had dropped past its hub. The axle was wedged against something neither man could see. Dabney was still working a knot at his own harness, fingers gone clumsy with cold. axle's caught on rock," Boyd called out. "Won't come free by pulling straight." Tuko was already under one breath, gone below the black water at the wagon's flank. He surfaced with an answer instead of a report. "Not rock?" Nothing more followed it. He set his shoulder to the wheel's rim at an angle Boyd never would have chosen. Sideways, not against the current, but with it, using the river's own push instead of fighting it. Boyd caught the idea a half-second late and threw his weight in beside him. The wagon gave all at once. It lurched off whatever had held it, and the current took it downstream in a long groan of wood before the rope crew caught the trailing line and held. 2 men still in the water. Hollis came up the bank on his own legs first, shaking, alive, a rope burn across one palm that would ache worse than it bled. Dabney was out past the drop-off, one arm hooked through a wagon, spoke no longer attached to anything solid. The current worked to peel him loose, one finger at a time. Boyd went in without deciding to. Tuko was already ahead. Up on the bank near the gate, Sani had not moved from where the crossing let her watch the whole of it. She said nothing. Not to the men running past her, not to anyone. She only watched the 2 shapes in the water, the boy and the man who would not stop following him, with an attention that had nothing to do with the wagon at all. The current here ran faster than it had at the horses, funneled tight between the wagon's bulk and a gravel bar just under the surface. Boyd felt it try to take his legs out from under him twice. Then he found footing that held. They reached Dabney together, one on each side, and pulled. The private came free in stages, the arm, then the shoulder, then the full dead weight of a man who'd used up everything he had just staying attached to a wheel. Boyd got a grip under one arm while Tuko planted both feet and hauled from the other side. No strain showed in his face, only the flat concentration of a boy finishing a job he already knew how to do. They dragged Dabney onto the gravel on his hands and knees, coughing river water. Alive! Boyd reached to steady the boy, an old reflex, a hand out for balance on uneven ground, and found the gourd canteen instead. It hung loose at Tuko's hip, the cord half twisted by the current, and his fingers closed around it before he'd asked permission of the rest of himself. He meant to let go in a second. He didn't. The carving under his thumb was old, worn smooth in the places a hand returns to without thinking. For one heartbeat, the riverbank wasn't there at all. Dry heat instead of wet cold, dust instead of mud. A different hand raised the same way, palm out, offering something instead of holding it back. Gone before he could ask it to stay. Gone before he even knew what he'd been shown. His hand was still closed around the gourd. "Ranger," Tuko's voice, flat, not unkind. He hadn't pulled away, only waiting. Boyd let go like the wood had gone hot. Neither of them said anything else. They stood in the shallows side by side, breathing hard, watching Reyes's men drag Dabney toward blankets and a fire that suddenly sounded like the only good idea anyone had had all night. The river kept moving past their knees, indifferent, already lower than it had been 10 minutes before, already forgetting the wagon it had almost kept. Boyd looked at the boy once, sideways, and found no answers in him. Only a child watching brown water go by like he half expected it to say something else before it finished. Something cold had walked through Boyd's chest at the crossing, and it hadn't left with the water. It sat behind his ribs now, old and quiet, patient as a splinter, gone numb, still under the skin, still working toward the surface. Morning came anyway. The river had dropped back inside its banks before dawn, indifferent now to the wagon it had almost swallowed, the men it had almost kept. Fort Bliss woke to mud instead of catastrophe, and mud weighed against what the night might have cost, felt almost like mercy. The sun came up hard and already hot, the kind of light that had a man's shirt sticking to his back before he'd finished a full hour's work. Somewhere past the rise, a mourning dove kept asking the same low question over and over. Nobody answered that one either. Relief moved through the yard like its own kind of weather. Reyes stood at the rail, retelling the crossing to any private who'd stop long enough to listen, his hands doing the current's work in the air, the wagon here, the rope there, himself somewhere heroic in the middle of it. A version Boyd didn't quite remember from the actual night. Voss had already drafted half the morning report before breakfast, already deciding which details made the post look prepared instead of merely lucky. Dabney sat wrapped in a spare blanket by the mess fire, hoarse, grinning, telling it wrong in the specific way survivors always did. Braver in the retelling than he'd been in the water. Nobody begrudged him the difference. Hollis limped past with his rope-burned palm wrapped in a strip of clean cloth, showing it off to anyone who'd look, already half in love with the scar he was going to carry out of this. Small price, everyone seemed to agree, for 2 men and a wagon and a night that could have gone so much worse. Boyd stood apart from all of it, currying a horse that hadn't asked to be curried twice in one morning. His hands knew the motion without him. Long strokes, root to tail, the kind of chore a man could disappear inside if he worked it slow enough. He worked it very slow. Nobody thanked him directly. He noticed the absence, then hated himself a little for noticing it, as if gratitude were a wage he'd waded into that river, hoping to collect. The credit ran, correctly, the other direction. Reyes called Tuko that Apache boy twice before noon, real warmth in it both times. The closest the fort came all morning to using his name. Tuko took the praise in the same small currency he spent on everything else. A short nod. No more words than the moment required. He sat cross-legged near the gate, working a wet knot from the gourd's braided cord. Patient, unhurried, in no rush to be anywhere the fort's gratitude might follow him. Once, without looking up from the knot, he said, "You're staring, Ranger." Not an accusation, just a fact, laid down as plain as everything else he said. Boyd hadn't realized he'd stopped moving, didn't mean to, didn't say you meant to. Tuko went back to the cord, unhurried, patient with a knot that would give way eventually if nothing else did. Whatever else he might have wanted to ask, he let the knot answer for him instead. Voss found Boyd at the picket line an hour later, ledger tucked under one arm. "Need the crossing on paper by noon, yours and Reyes's both? Department wants a full account given the season." He tapped the ledger's spine, already half-turned to go. "Straightforward enough. You were there." Boyd's hand went still on the horse's flank. He had been there, true enough to write down without a single lie in it, the wagon, the rope, a boy finding a wedged axle by feel in black water. Easy sentences, all of them. He had built whole reports out of harder material than this, with a steadier hand than the one currently resting on a stranger's horse. Some old familiar arithmetic ran itself behind his eyes anyway, which details a report kept, which ones it let the ink quietly swallow for the sake of a cleaner page. He knew that arithmetic, He'd spent 8 years getting good at it. The pen would go where he pointed it. It always had. That was the trouble with a hand that steady. It had never once refused an order, no matter which truth got left off the page, to keep it that way. Not this one, he told himself. Nothing in this one is worth hiding. He almost believed it. The horse shifted under his hand, patient, and he went back to the currying because his hands trusted plain work more than they trusted his thoughts right now. That was when he felt her watching him. Not the fort's kind of attention, the kind that moved through camp like weather and asked nothing back in return. This was older, steadier, a weight settling against the side of his face, there and then gone, and there again a moment later, when he failed to turn fast enough to catch it. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself that twice more before some part of him quit believing it, and by the third telling, the comb was already back on the rail. Sani stood near the gate where she'd stood every third Tuesday for 8 years. This morning, though, she wasn't watching the gate, measuring, not staring. The same unhurried arithmetic she'd once spent on a dipper of well water, deciding whether a gesture was worth the trouble of trusting. Boyd crossed the yard before he'd fully decided to go. "Something on your mind, ma'am?" He kept his voice easy. Easy cost him more than it should have. 8 years is a long time to carry a thing alone. Sani said it plain, no accusation riding under it anywhere he could find, which somehow made it worse than accusation would have. Longer, carrying it wrong. His mouth had gone dry in a way the morning heat didn't explain. "Ma'am, I don't follow you." Sani let the silence sit a moment before she spent another word on it. The same unhurried patience she'd spent on flour sacks and ladles and 8 years of Tuesdays. "I think you do." She didn't raise her voice to say it. She never had to. "I'm not asking what you did." Her eyes hadn't left him since he'd crossed the yard. Steady as the rail, he'd have given a great deal to be holding on to right now. "I'm asking if you still remember his name." The yard kept moving around the two of them. Reyes, still talking, a picket rope, coiling. Somebody's laughter, carrying thin across the mud. None of it reached the 6 feet of ground between Boyd and the old woman standing in the middle of it. Patient as she'd been at the well that first evening, patient as she'd been every third Tuesday since, long before Boyd could have said why the boy's stillness felt like a debt. "Istu," Sani said, when the silence had stretched long enough to answer her on its own. "Do you remember Istu?" Boyd didn't answer, not right away. The name sat in him like a stone dropped down a well he'd thought was dry. Small sound, long silence, then nothing but the knowing it had reached bottom. Sani didn't ask twice. She only waited, patient as she'd once been with a dipper of water 8 years of Tuesdays ago. Then she let the quiet do the asking for her. "Istu?" Boyd said finally. His own voice sounded borrowed. "I remember him." "I didn't ask if you remembered." Sani's eyes stayed on him. "I asked if you still did." He had no answer ready for the difference. She turned before he found one, already certain he would follow, and walked toward the shade at the end of the stable wall, away from Reyes and his retelling, away from the mud, drying pale under 20 boots. Tuko stayed by the gate with his knot, in no hurry to be anywhere his grandmother hadn't sent him. In the shade, out of the yard's hearing, his throat worked twice before anything came out of it. When the words finally came, they came quiet, like a man laying down something heavy so it wouldn't wake what was sleeping under it. "I was there, ma'am." Sani nodded, slow, like a woman setting down a weight she'd carried further than she'd meant to. "I wondered some Tuesdays, never enough to ask." She looked back toward the gate, toward the boy and his knot. "Last night, watching you not let go of that gourd, that was enough." Then she told it. Plain, spare, no more decoration than the truth needed. She hadn't stood at Hueco Tanks herself that day. 2 men of her own band had. Their account never once matched the Army's, though no post in the territory had ever troubled itself to ask a second time. 8 years gone, at Hueco Tanks, a rancher 2 days' ride from anywhere lost 11 horses. He put the blame where blame was cheapest to put it, and a patrol rode out to ask questions, rifles already loose in their scabbards. Heat came up off the rock in waves thick enough to bend the horizon. The only sounds for a mile were wind working through the stone hollows and the low click of a hammer easing back. Istu came down off the rocks alone, both hands raised, the carved gourd held up between them. Not a weapon. Water. The oldest offering his people had, given to anyone who came dry to that place, friend or accuser. It made no difference. He wanted to talk. He wanted, more than a dying man ever wants anything, to be heard before he was judged. Someone's rifle was already up before his second step. A voice already certain of what it saw before the dust had cleared enough to see anything at all. The shot came before the doubt did. Istu went down into the rock and the heat. The gourd rolled twice against the stone and stopped, unbroken, water spilling dark across pale ground. A private stood close enough to see all of it. The raised hands, the gourd, the nothing in them that could have killed anyone. He said none of it aloud. Not that day when the lieutenant already had his pencil out and a cleaner word than murder waiting on the end of it. Not the day after, when hostile resistance to a charge of horse theft went into a report. Nobody above a captain would ever trouble himself to question it. His name sat quiet at the bottom of that page, having done nothing to stop it. The patrol rode back to the post as if the ground they'd left behind had settled the matter for good. 37, Boyd said when the silence asked him to. Not an excuse, just a fact, laid down the same plain way Sani laid down everything else. Still a private at 37, scared of the lieutenant, scared of being the man who called an officer a liar in front of the whole patrol. He looked at his own hands like they belonged to somebody he used to know. Told myself I'd correct it later, when it was safer. Later got easier to put off every year they trusted me with something new. Harder to hand back a name once men had already built their opinion of you on top of it. Shame hadn't stayed the size it started at 37. 8 years on, it had grown into the exact shape of the man trying to outrun it. A river always finds its way back to the ground that was once its own, Sani said. So does the truth, given enough time and somebody willing to let it. He'd tried to pay it more than once, across 8 years of third Tuesdays. An extra sack, left where the count wouldn't quite balance. A blanket once, folded at the rail like it had simply been forgotten there. Medicine for the boy's cough one hard winter, left with no note to explain it. Coin twice, pressed on her without a word, and returned to his own saddlebag by morning without a word either time. She had let none of it land. Today, in the shade, he tried once more, plainer than he ever had. Money, whatever supplies the post could spare. A name cleared quietly between the two of them, and nobody else the wiser. Sani shook her head, the same unhurried no she'd given every time before. You didn't lose something I can sell back to you. Her eyes held his, steady, the last of the softness gone out of them now. And I won't be the one who hands you the easy way clear of this. That part's yours to carry to the end of it, same as you carried the rest. Boyd stood in the shade a long moment after she'd said her piece, hat in his hands. For the first time in 8 years, he felt like a man with nothing left folded up his sleeve. Somewhere behind them, ordinary as ever, a mess cook scraped a scorched pot and swore at it in 2 languages. A horse stamped at flies along the picket line. The fort went on being a fort, indifferent to what had just come apart and been named in its shade in one man standing still. That was when Major Everett Stroud came around the corner of the stable at a near trot, already talking before he'd finished arriving. Larkin, good, you're here. His grin belonged to a man who'd just found the one clean thing in a hard week and meant to spend it in public. Colonel's given his blessing. Tonight, full formation. We honor that boy proper, in front of the whole post. $100 in silver, presented right there in the yard. He clapped Boyd's shoulder like a man closing a deal he already considered settled. Want you standing with me when we call him up. Folks ought to see the 2 of you together. The clap on Boyd's shoulder was still warm when Stroud's boot started off across the yard. He was already 3 sentences deep into how the colonel would want it worded for the wire. $100 in silver, a grateful post, a story simple enough that nobody upriver would ask it twice. Stroud liked stories that didn't ask twice. Boyd stood at the rail a long moment, alone with what had just been decided for him. Reyes found him there an hour later, ledger half filled already with names for the honor guard. Major wants it done proper, he said, pleased with himself. A man handed a good errand for once, and glad of it. Whole post standing. Asked should the crossing report go up alongside it. Wagon, the axle, the boy going under for it. Department likes paper behind a medal. Tonight? Didn't say tonight. Said soon. Reyes shrugged, already moving to his next name. Something wrong with the account? No. The word came easy. It always had. Nothing wrong with it. Reyes went back to his ledger, satisfied, and never heard what the answer cost. Boyd caught the major near the flagpole an hour before muster, running the evening's order past the adjutant like a man rehearsing a toast he already knew by heart. Sir, about the crossing report. Told Reyes to fold it in whole. Wagon, horses, the boy under that axle. Stroud didn't look up from his notes. Good copy. Department eats it up. There's more in it than the wagon, sir. That earned him a glance. Brief. Already moving past it. Is there? Stroud capped his pen. Larkin, I've got a colonel happy for the first time in a month, and a Territory 2 scouts and 1 bad rumor from calling up every rifle north of this river. Victorio's people are 2 days off in 3 different directions, depending who you ask. I need this post looking sure of itself tonight, not sifting 8-year-old paper because somebody's conscience got restless during a flood. He said it kindly enough. That was the worst part of it. Whatever else you're carrying, tonight isn't the night to set it down. Old reports better left old. Hear me, Larkin? Yes, sir. Not agreement, only the shape of one. Stroud had already reached for his hat and had no reason left to listen for the difference. Boyd tried once more anyway, before the major was fully out of earshot. Sir, If the department ever asked a harder question about that report, they won't. Why would they? Stroud didn't break stride. The matter was closed as far as he was concerned, filed away with the rest of the evening's business. A dead rancher's horses, a patrol doing its job, closed and forgotten 8 years before either of us had cause to think twice on it. Nobody digs up a grave to see if it's still got a body in it, Larkin. Not in a season like this one. He was gone before the words finished landing. Boyd walked back across the yard slower than the errand asked of him. His quarters held the same drawer they'd held that morning, the same paper inside it worn from 8 years of a thumb that wouldn't leave it be. He didn't open it, didn't need to. He already knew the weight of it by heart. He took his revolver apart instead, stripped a cylinder that hadn't fired all week, oiled the action past any need it had for oiling, hands wanting the same busy nothing they'd wanted over a horse's coat that morning. Careful. Beside the point. Anything, so long as it kept his hands too full to let the rest of him catch up. Outside the window, the evening went on being ordinary. A mess cook's ladle against a pot, a horse stamping at the picket line, someone's boot heel unhurried on the boardwalk. For 1/2 second, the sound folded into another one entirely. Rock instead of adobe. Heat instead of evening. A hammer easing back somewhere behind him. The same one he hadn't heard in 8 years, and heard anyway every single day. Then the window was only a window again, and the gun in his hands had been clean for a week already. Stroud wasn't wrong. Not about the territory, not the colonel, or the timing, or what one quiet night could do for a nervous post. A man could stack up a dozen true things and still build a lie from the pile. Silence again, dressed this time in caution instead of fear. Duty instead of a scared man's excuse. Same coat, let out to fit a bigger man. 45 years old, and he was reaching for the exact door he'd reached for at 37. Only now he called it prudence. The badge on his vest made the calling easier. He thought, for the length of one breath, about crossing the yard to find her, telling her himself, plain, before Stroud ever raised his voice over a sack of silver. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took to think it. Then it folded away, same as everything else he didn't say. He set the revolver down, clean, and picked up a pencil instead. Turned a blank requisition sheet to its plain side. Wrote Istu at the top of it before he decided to write anything at all. Looked at the name a long while. Folded the sheet in half. Did not put it in the drawer with the other one. By the time he stepped back out, the light had started to lean. Long gold across the parade ground. The Franklins had gone violet, then a deep, cooling gray, the day's heat finally letting go of the adobe an inch at a time. Near the well, Sani worked a length of blue cloth between her hands, corner to corner, pressing each fold flat, unhurried. Tuko stood still for her, chin level, letting the fort arrange itself around him without asking it to hurry. He didn't fidget, didn't glance at the men stacking crates into a platform, or the private stringing a second lantern by the flagpole. He only waited. Dust already finding his boots again, same as always. One more thing the day had decided to hand him. He'd take it the same plain way he took everything else. No rush in him anywhere. No fear in him either, near as Boyd could tell. The bugle went up a little after 7, thin and bright, over the flat of the whole post. Boots came out of every doorway at once, buttons finished on the move. 4 days of dust brushed off in the last 10 steps before the line. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the whole garrison stood formed in 2 long ranks across the yard, torchlight catching brass buttons and rifle barrels down the entire line. Major Everett Stroud stepped out in front of the formation, a canvas sack heavy in one hand, and raised his voice to carry the full length of it. "Bring the boy up." Nobody had to say his name twice. Tuko crossed the whole open ground between the well and the flagpole alone. No other child stood anywhere in that yard tonight. Only him. Dust found his moccasins again. The gourd knocked once against his hip and went still. Leggings pale at the knee, a calico shirt, traded fare at that same gate more times than the fort had ever bothered to count. He did not look down at the ground he was crossing, not once, the whole way across it. He stopped an arm's length from Major Stroud, chin level. He did not wait to be told where to stand. Stroud's grin was working the crowd before his mouth had caught up to it, and he lifted the canvas sack until torchlight found the silver inside. He poured it into his open palm. Bright, heavy, more money than most men at that fort would see in a year. For the boy who kept 2 of ours out of that river, his voice carried the length of both ranks. $100, the thanks of this whole post. He held it out. Tuko looked at the coins. A moment, long enough to be sure of himself, and not 1 second longer. Then he set his palm flat against the money. He pushed the sack back into Stroud's chest. The major's grin held a half-second past the point where it stopped meaning anything. Not silver. Tuko didn't raise his voice to say it. He never had to. His eyes came up off the coins and onto the man. They did not drop again. Not to the dirt, not to the ranks, not to Boyd, standing 3 steps off. The truth, said out loud where this whole fort can hear it, and my father's name cut right at Hueco Tanks. 2 long ranks of soldiers, and not one of them made a sound, while somewhere down the line a horse shifted its weight and stamped once. Even the torches seemed to hold still. Stroud's hand stayed half closed around the air where the sack used to be. Reyes found something urgent to study in his own boots. Voss found something further off still, past the flagpole, past the ridge. For the length of one held breath, an 11-year-old boy in trade cloth and moccasins was the only person in that yard who knew what he wanted. Every grown man standing in torchlight around him had just discovered that he did not. Boyd broke rank. He'd told himself, walking out to that formation, that he'd stand exactly where Stroud pointed him and hold his silence one more night. It was the same arithmetic he'd balanced for 8 years running. His boots carried him forward anyway. Past the front line, past the major's shoulder, he came to a stop beside the boy, not a pace behind him this time. "He's right, sir." Boyd's voice was quieter than Stroud's had been. It didn't need to carry. The whole yard had already gone quiet enough to hear a canteen settle in the dirt. There's an account of Hueco Tanks that calls a murdered man's death a hostile act. My silence sits at the bottom of the page, holding it up. A private stood close enough to see all of it that day. The raised hands, the gourd, the water, and not a weapon anywhere in it. He said none of it aloud when a lieutenant's pencil turned the truth into resistance. That private was me. His name was Istu. I've let the lie stand 8 years instead of the one evening it should have taken. He faced Stroud, not the boy, for what came next. I'm asking that it go into this post's record tonight, under my name, whatever it costs." Stroud's jaw worked once before any words reached it. "You understand what that costs you, Larkin?" "Yes, sir." A short breath. "I've had 8 years to work out the price." The major didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The colonel's desk would answer it for him soon enough, and both men standing in that yard already knew the shape of it. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the flagpole, already rehearsing some harder version of the evening's report than the one he'd meant to send. By the time the bugle called the post back to quarters, Reyes already had a fresh leaf open in the ledger. For once, nobody stood over his shoulder telling him which words to leave off the page. Tuko asked for the truth instead of the silver. Would you have known the difference if it were offered to you? Most grown men standing in that yard would have pocketed the coin instead and called it a fair trade. Tell us below which one you'd have asked for in his place. And if a fort on the Rio Grande held your attention a while tonight, there's another post waiting down the trail, same time next week. Some weeks later, a wagon climbed the last rise into Hueco Tanks. The sky above it had gone the pale gold of early morning. Wind moved low through the rocks, stirring dust that had settled there for 8 years. The tanks held their water the same as they always had, older than the fort, older than any patrol that ever argued over which of them owned this ground. A new marker stood at the base of the rocks, plain granite. Istu's true name was cut into it, deep enough to outlast 100 more years of wind. Sani stood before it a long while, saying nothing a stranger could have understood. Tuko knelt at the stone. He filled the carved gourd from the same tank his father once drank from. Then he set it upright at the marker's foot, the way a man leaves something behind for someone thirsty to find. A river always finds its way back to the ground that was once its own. Sani said it to nobody in particular, or maybe to all of it at once. So does the truth, given enough time. She spoke toward the stone, not toward Boyd standing a respectful few feet off. This one took 8 years, and a boy too young to know how to give up on it. Boyd didn't argue the point. He'd run out of better ones a long while back. Tuko straightened from the marker last, dust already back at his knees. He stood beside his grandmother now, not a pace behind her, level with the ranger, for the first time since the two of them had met. "It's lighter now," he said. "His name, in the wind."